Thank you, Carl. Thank you, Leanne. Thank you, everybody, for being here and for giving me some time and a chance to talk for a few minutes and then a chance to take your questions. If you can't hear me in the back, please raise your hand. You can hear me. It's good. All right. I try not to be overpowering, but sometimes I just want to make sure everybody can hear me. So I may look a little sleepy to you. I just got off a plane last night from a bipartisan trip. 7 senators went to the United Kingdom, to Jordan, to Israel, and to Greece. And I'd be happy to talk about that in some more detail if it's of interest to you. We met with Boris Johnson, the foreign minister, and with the national security advisor in the United Kingdom to talk about our security cooperation, Brexit, and what it means for the UK and the future of the EU and the United States. In Jordan, we met with the King, King Abdullah, and his wife, Queen Rania, to talk about their security situation and their economy in particular. As you may know, Jordan has taken in a huge number of refugees from Syria, which is immediately adjacent to it. The king is probably our strongest partner in the Muslim world, a direct lineal descendant of the Prophet Muhammad and the keeper of the sacred sites of Jerusalem. He faces a very challenging and unstable situation. And we got to visit Petra on the side, which was lovely. Then we went to Tel Aviv, the Sea of Galilee, the Golan Heights, Jerusalem, the Dead Sea, and Beersheba, and met with Prime Minister Netanyahu, with the Minister of Defense, Avi Lieberman, with the new head of the Labor Party, Avi Gabe. We got briefed by the Deputy Chief of Staff of the IDF. I went into Ramallah for meetings with Palestinians, and then had a series of meetings in Jerusalem with both civil society and tech entrepreneur folks, and would be happy to talk in more detail about any of that. And the visit to Greece was probably the biggest surprise to me, because Greece, after 8 years of the greatest depression they've ever known, their economy collapsed, and they lost a quarter of their GDP. And they've been under very stringent oversight by the IMF. We met their relatively new prime minister. Their economy is beginning to recover. Their tourism is beginning to recover. They've made very hard choices as a government. And I don't think I appreciated how good a security partner they are for Israel and for the United States in the region. We talked a lot about Libya, which is immediately to the south, about Russia and their interference in the elections, not just in Greece, but in the region, and in the interesting but somewhat obscure issue of the name of the former Yugoslav Republic of Macedonia, which, as soon as they get over fighting over the name, will join NATO. In case you thought this was an obscure issue, there was a protest about the possibility that this piece of dirt, whose capital is Skopje, and which wants to be called Macedonia, bless you, Carl, there was a protest in downtown Athens of 500,000 people, 500,000 people, chanting slogans against the name of this place that we all might call Macedonia, but the Greeks are really determined will not be Macedonia. And I said to the Prime Minister, I'm sorry, it's a little hard for me to grasp exactly why 500,000 people. And he said, well, the current government of this place has spent $1 billion on statues of Alexander the Great, a highway named Alexander the Great, a stadium named Alexander the Great, and Alexander the Great is not from that place. He's from Greece. Okay. Sorry I asked. It is, and Lindsey Graham, Senator Graham of South Carolina, was the this trip. And I'll tell you, he is one of the funniest guys. And he leans back and says, that is saying Greek, y'all just got to get over some of this stuff and let it go. And I'm not sure the Prime Minister saw the humor in that as much as I did. The good news about this trip, I think, was not just that we dedicated time to visiting with some of our key allies, looking at how much we're spending to support them, and asking questions about their economy and their security situation, but that you had 4 Republicans and 3 Democrats, a few spouses, not mine, and staff, and we went to these different countries, had meetings, and then sat in the evening and talked about it. The 2 Democrats, Maggie Hassan of New Hampshire and Catherine Cortez Masto of Nevada, are first-term senators. In fact, for Senator Hassan and Senator Cortez Masto, it was their first time ever going on a congressional trip. And for Senator Flake of Arizona and Senator Cassidy of Louisiana, These are fairly seasoned senators, along, did I say Gardner of Colorado, as well as Lindsey Graham. Lindsey Graham is in charge of the subcommittee that spends all of our foreign affairs, foreign aid, and State Department money, a subcommittee on which I serve. It's a good thing because the previous Thursday, we had a series of votes on immigration, on what's going to happen with border security and building President Trump's wall, and the status of about 1.8 million Americans who were brought here illegally by their parents, but who have known no other country, have grown up here, and either are in school or working or are serving in the military, this group called the Dreamers. And as I think you may know, after a lot of fighting over what's the path forward, President Trump agreed that he would welcome a pathway to citizenship for 1.8 million Dreamers, a significant change in position for him. Funny you should mention that. And a group of us, led by Susan Collins of Maine, about 25 of us, met for several weeks to hammer out a bill where we essentially agreed to give him his $25 billion over 10 years to invest in border security, and I'm happy to talk through the details, and to make a change to so-called family migration or chain migration in exchange for getting these 1.8 million Dreamers a path towards being here and becoming citizens over a dozen years. I thought that bill was going to get 60 votes until the morning. As you may know, in the Senate of the United States, if you don't get 60 votes, you don't move forward. It's something called a cloture vote. But we're the only body between the House and the Senate where the minority still has some voice. In the House, whoever's the majority runs everything. If you're in the minority, you can give a nice speech, but you really can't have any impact on the outcome. In the Senate, we've changed the rules in ways that make it harder and harder for the minority to have any impact. But when it comes to legislation, it still takes 60 votes for something to move forward. So after a couple weeks of fighting about it, we finally put 4 bills on the floor. The first one was the McCain-Coons bill. And I'll tell you, I was genuinely surprised and honored that John McCain called me from Arizona, where he is struggling with brain cancer, to say, Chris, I want us to put a bill in that strengthens border security and gives these kids a path to citizenship. And I've got the right bill for us. It's a bipartisan bill from the House. The Republican sponsor has 800 miles of border with Mexico in his district. He's a former CIA officer named Will Hurd, congressman from El Paso. And he, and a Democrat from Southern California, wrote this bill that has 54 co-sponsors. 27 Republicans, 27 Democrats. Let's put it in and see what we can get. I don't know why he chose me. But last June, I got the honor of going to Vietnam with John. And then to Singapore. And in Singapore, we met with leadership from 7 other countries around the region who asked us really hard questions about what's happened to America. Where are you going? And in Vietnam, we got the chance to visit the ship, the Navy ship, the USS John McCain. Named not for him, but for his father and grandfather, both 4-star admirals, who led the Pacific Fleet in the Second World War and who led the Pacific Fleet during the Vietnam War. And before that, we got to spend 2 days in Hanoi to visit the prison where he served as a prisoner of war and to meet with all the leadership of Vietnam, who absolutely worshipped him. And one of the more striking moments, I have a picture of John McCain meeting with the, I think, president of Vietnam underneath this enormous bust of Ho Chi Minh. I don't think John McCain, when he was imprisoned, could have imagined a day where he would be welcomed and cheered by crowds in Hanoi, and that he would be meeting with the leadership of Vietnam, where they are so eager for our partnership. We went to the Museum of the War of American Aggression. It's not what I would call it. And it was really something, because there's pieces of B-52s, tanks, jeeps, all sorts of insignia from American units. But if you go to the whole museum, there's 1,000 years of Chinese aggression against Vietnam. 1,000 years. They've got displays and dioramas. And then there's 200 years of French colonial oppression. And then there's this little war with the United States. And then it's back to fighting with the Chinese. But you got to tour the whole thing. You can't just visit the little part that's about our war. And listening to their leadership, I began to realize they've been fighting the Chinese as long as they've existed as a people. And they desperately want our partnership in helping them push back on China. And that's the same thing I heard with John in Singapore in a regional security conference where all the countries of the Pacific were gathered. They want us invaded. They desperately want us, and they want our leadership. So let me go back to last Thursday and then wrap up. The McCain-Coons bill got a vote. It only got 52. If John had been there, I think we would have gotten more. Then this bipartisan consensus bill that gives the president 3 out of 4 of the things he asked for, that got a vote. And we got 54. The last thing that got a vote was President Trump's preferred alternative, the Grassley-Cotton-Purdue bill, which does away with the ability of American citizens to sponsor much of their family members to come to the United States under family migration, and does away with the diversity visa lottery. Guess how many votes it got? 39. Someone's really watching this show. It got 60 votes against it. It's the only thing that got 60 against. So the folks I was on this trip with this past week, we spent a fair amount of time talking through what happened and where do we go next. Let me close with this. I was just over at charter school. Charter is one of the best performing schools in Delaware. Talked to about 500 students and listened to them. Guess what the number one thing is on their mind? Guns. Because today, the students of Dorothy Stoneman Douglas High School in Parkland, Florida, get to come back for the first time. Think about it. These kids are 16, 17, 18, and what they're watching on social media, and occasionally on television, probably never in the newspaper, is that these kids their age are going back into their high school to pick up their backpacks, to get their phones, to get their textbooks that they dropped when they ran for their lives, as they heard their friends from band or chemistry class being machine gunned to death and murdered. What 17-year-old should have to worry about this? And there's a lot of ideas for what to do. I got a bunch of texts when I was in Israel from a high school classmate of mine. He's a classic Delaware, chemical engineer, worked for DuPont, and he's got his own company now selling Kevlar solutions to unusual problems. And he's selling backpacks and clipboards for teachers and students that have a very thin Kevlar in it. Seems crazy. Our president, as you know, is championing the idea of arming and training school teachers in our schools. My mother and my grandmother were public school teachers. And I'll tell you that I think we ask our teachers to do a lot as it is. We ask them to also be trained guards and entrusted with the use of deadly force, and to complicate what is already a chaotic situation by having lots of other adults with guns, I think is a challenging proposition. On the other hand, I expect us to take up in the next few weeks a number of proposals to strengthen the background check system, to raise the age at which you can purchase an AR-15, to outlaw bump stocks, which is what the killer in Las Vegas used to take a semi-automatic and make it fully automatic, and to restrict the size of magazines. I don't know if any of these things will get a vote. Probably not, bluntly. And I'm happy to take questions and advice on what you would have me do on this. The Second Amendment is an amendment to our Constitution, just like the First Amendment. I think I know whose first question I'm going to take. And the Supreme Court has recognized that the Second Amendment is an individual right, not just a right to a well-ordered militia. So I frankly think anybody who believes that at some point there will be a majority in Congress that will take away the guns of those who own them and who are law-abiding citizens, I don't think that's ever going to happen. I'm a hunter. My sons and I have gone deer hunting and turkey hunting. I know lots of people who own weapons for self-protection. I not only have no problem with that, that's a lot of our country and its history. But for me, the idea that an 18-year-old with demonstrable mental health problems can walk into a gun store when he can't buy a beer or a pack of cigarettes, but he can walk into a gun store and walk out with an AR-15 and unlimited ammunition, I think that's nuts. And I think we should take some measures to make it harder for people who are convicted felons, who've been adjudicated mentally ill, or who are recently who've been convicted at any point of domestic violence from walking in and walking out with guns. Now let me just compliment. Delaware has bipartisan leaders who have worked to make sure that this state has tougher and more rigorous background checks and has made it harder to get access to weapons. As a country, we have not done that. Fully 40% of the weapons sold are sold through gun shows or private sales where there is either no background check performed or where the access to the national background check system is unreliable. There is another view, and I look forward to hearing it from my colleagues when I get to Washington this afternoon. But I'd be interested in hearing from you more than anything else. The young people I was just with are living in a different era than the one I grew up in or the one you grew up in. They don't know a world before the internet. They value immigration and diversity. They have different views on the economy, security, and our future. Their number one concern is student loan debt. Their number two concern is government. You've lived a different time and a different history. But I'll say this, the thing that worries me the most is that high school and college kids, when asked about whether democracy is important, only 60% say yes. Only 60% say yes. Some of them think socialism is a better way to go because they don't know any better. I'm sorry, that sounds, but frankly, because it sounds wonderful and romantic, and they didn't live during the Cold War, they don't have much of a sense of the alternative. And some of them believe what they heard from the candidates of both the Republican and Democratic Party in the last presidential, who said the whole thing's rigged. So just think about it for a moment. My father served during the Cold War. My brother served. My uncle served. My sister-in-law served. Generations of Americans from the Second World War to the Korean War to the Vietnam War served and built a world based not on American military power, but on our values. I'm convinced that the last 70 years we made the world safer and better and stronger, not just for us, but for billions of people, by promoting democracy and transparency and capitalism. But we've got a young generation that doesn't necessarily see it that way. So, I'd be interested in hearing what you think about all of this. I think I'm relying on you, Carl, to make sure that folks get to ask questions in good order. Doris, I'm sorry. Thank you, Doris. And Leanne. And I'm happy to take your questions, and I've got, 45 minutes, if you do. So, thank you for a chance to be with you. And if you can get the attention of these two talented ladies.
Senator, I just have a statement. I'm a retired police officer.
Yes, sir.
I retired in '83, and I worked at Streets of Wilmington, Delaware. Also was in the service 25th Infantry Division in the East. I was a trained combat officer, right? What's the difference between these weapons than the normal weapons that are used with police officers? The difference is that we're talking about war weapons that are being allowed to sell in this country. So that's about it.
I'll just simply say back, I think I understand the point you're making. I can't walk into a store and buy a rocket launcher or a hand grenade. I can't. It's not legal in the United States. Because they're weapons of war. They don't belong in civilian society. Yet we've made a decision as a country that it's okay to go get an AR-15 that I can turn into a machine gun with a $10 part. and I can buy unlimited ammunition with massive magazines that allows me to kill people at a speed and a lethality and an accuracy that was designed for combat. There is no deer that requires me to have an AK-47 or an AR-15. Now, I understand there's folks who think an AR-15 is fun to take to a rifle range and shoot at targets. Great, God bless you. But I have trouble with the idea that they are just, people are just walking around with them with no limitations whatsoever. So, thank you for your service. I will tell you the most striking thing that happened to me on my trip home. We stopped in Shannon, Ireland. And in the same place where we were getting a beer and just, taking a stop while they refueled was about 150 young men and a few women heading to Afghanistan for a year and a half. And as I stood and listened to these young men, it just happened that everyone I talked to was from the 4th Infantry. They're going to Helmand Province in Afghanistan. I never forget that we have young women and young men who we are asking to serve today in Syria, in Iraq, and Afghanistan. And there is no end in sight to these conflicts. And given what I saw on this trip, no reason to expect that this will end in our lifetime. And I worry about the burdens we're placing on them, because previous generations who went and fought and saw really horrible things did so for 3 or 4 or 5 years. Not for 8, not for 10, not for 20. We are asking these young people to do things that no soldiers in American history have had to do, in terms of doing tour after tour after tour. And I worry that we are asking a lot of them.
You just predicted, I think, that none of those gun control measures, which get up to 95% of public support, are going to pass. Why not? Who is going to block it? And what are you going to do about it?
Great question. He was a journalist, right? I'm not usually a sharply partisan person. That's not my style. And I'm actually very hopeful that a conservative Republican senator from a state that's just a little bit north of ours, whose last name begins in D, might be introducing a bill with me this week to fix a problem that there isn't a bill about right now. I've been trying to get him to yes for a couple months, and we traded some calls over the weekend. Why are these bills likely not going to pass? Well, I believed that we were going to get that immigration bill done right up until last Thursday. We had 60 votes, but the president and his Secretary of Homeland Security, first thing last Thursday, started getting on the phone and telling Republican senators this is a terrible idea. It'll open the floodgates to illegal immigration, and he succeeded in killing it. The president is currently saying that he wants to ban bump stocks, to change the age of purchase, to increase background checks, but I frankly think, given what I've seen in the last year, that once we get close to a vote, he will get pushed very hard by the NRA and some of his most conservative advisors. And he'll pick up the phone and call Mitch McConnell and say, don't let this thing go forward. I'm just saying that's what I saw last week. I hope I'm wrong. I hope this is different. And when a high school student at Charter said to me, what advice would you have for us who are organizing and advocating that we must change these laws? I said, don't give up, because the NRA is counting on you to change the subject, to change the channel, to get bored, and to think it's not such a big deal after all. Because frankly, I thought when Sandy Hook happened and 23 elementary school children were massacred, I never imagined that we would do nothing. Now, how many mass shootings have there been since that? Right? In a church, at a concert, at a nightclub, at a high school. Dozens. Is it really the price of freedom that we have to allow students to be massacred in our schools? And let's just be blunt. It's not just these big visible incidents where 17 kids get killed. It's happening every week on our streets, folks. We have way too many kids in Wilmington getting shot by other kids because we're not enforcing the straw purchaser laws as aggressively as we should, because we don't have CDC-funded research on gun violence, because we don't have a fully effective background check system, and because other states where you can buy guns easily flood the market, and they are brought here by folks engaged in drug dealing and crime. What am I going to do about it? Not give up, not change the subject, and not stop trying. Because bluntly, I was a co-sponsor of every one of the bills that came out after the Sandy Hook incident. I'm a co-sponsor of each of the viable bills currently in the Senate. And I am trying to find ways we can get it through judiciary. But bluntly, in 6 weeks, it is likely that the subject will change. Might not even be that long. Because we have a president who is a master of changing the subject. Of grabbing the wheel of the bus and saying, hey, let's talk about this, let's talk about that. He is very, very talented at changing the subject. So, please hold us accountable. If you don't like what I'm saying or doing on this, please. You do.
Senator, I'm going to change the subject now. How about Netanyahu?
Netanyahu.
I mean, I've been reading that he's under an indictment.
He's not been indicted.
That he's been, okay. What do you think he's going to, how, is he enjoying support still in Israel? Or, I mean, you have to be careful what you say. And what happens after him?
The question was, is Bibi Netanyahu under indictment? Is he under pressure? What was it like to meet with him, and what do I think happens next? Bibi Netanyahu his nickname in Israeli politics is the magician, because he seems to escape all sorts of near-death experiences. When he was prime minister in '97, he was investigated by the police in several corruption-related incidents. They recommended prosecution, but ultimately he was not indicted by the then Attorney General. The 4 different corruption-related investigations that are currently ongoing and where the police have recommended indictment, 4, I think will result in indictment this time. He has a very thin majority. Israeli politics are very different from the United States. Elected members of the Knesset do not have a constituency. So you don't have a member of the Knesset from Jaffa or from Haifa or from Beersheba. They represent the whole country, and they're done, anyway, it's really complicated. And they have like 25 parties. And Bibi is of Likud, and he has the single largest bloc in the Knesset. But he's got like 6 other political parties in his coalition, including some of the farthest right Orthodox groups. At some point, someone in his cabinet is going to say, I'm done, and I'm taking my 5 votes, my 10 votes, my 3 votes with me, and his coalition will come apart. Or we'll get to elections early next year. He is the least popular, but most powerful and successful nationwide politician. Let me see if I can explain that. Bibi, and we met with him for an hour. Like nothing's going on. 100% focused on Israel's security, on the threat of Iran, on what's going on in Lebanon and in Syria with Hezbollah. God bless him. That's been his shtick. That's his thing. Is that his entire time he has said, ignore this, a bunch of noise about me taking gifts and me cutting deals with the media and all sorts of stuff. It's a bunch of noise. I'm here to protect Israel's security. And he's probably the toughest and most conservative PM in Israeli history. And my gut is, if he stood for election today, he'd win. We met with the new head of the Labor Party. I've met previously with Naftali Bennett and with Yair Lapid, with his most likely opponents. I don't think any one of them has what it takes to win an Israeli election. It is an incredibly diverse country that includes Arabs and Jews, secular, Reform, conservative, Orthodox, ultra-Orthodox. And it is a remarkable constellation. Visiting the Knesset is a remarkable experience, and it allows me to recognize that the fights we have in Congress are nothing. I mean, they've literally got, but it's worth remembering this is the only democracy in the Middle East where you've got wide open debate. You've got folks in the Knesset who might as well be in Hamas, and you've got folks in the Knesset who might as well be socialists. And they're debating every day. And they actually have free and fair elections. So what's going to happen to Bibi? Only God knows. Will he get indicted? That's in the hands of an attorney general who is a member of his cabinet. And will he survive indictment? Right? But not that different from our situation. I mean, literally, we're sitting there meeting with him, and like we're all looking on our phones, and there's news about Mueller's just charged so-and-so. And, you know, he's like, can we keep talking? You're distracted? What's going on?
I just can't believe that there's so many things going on. I don't know where you put your priorities or what you think you can solve first. But just to dig up an old problem, what's going on with the nuclear deal in Iran?
So
As a member of the Foreign Relations Committee,
her question is, what's going on with what's called the JCPOA, or the nuclear deal with Iran? As I suspect you all know, President Trump ran again, in terms of President Trump's foreign policy, he said over and over and over that the Paris climate deal and the Iran nuclear deal were terrible deals, and he was going to tear them up his first day in office. Conveniently, he hasn't torn it up yet. We have broad agreement on the Foreign Relations Committee between the Republicans like Chairman Bob Corker and the Democrats, where they opposed the deal and we supported it. But we pretty uniformly agree that it is a good thing for now. We've got a problem with this country called North Korea that has nuclear bombs, that has missiles, and that is threatening to put one on top of the other and shoot it at us. And we don't have a good solution for it yet. In the meantime, why would we want Iran, which also has missiles and also has nuclear technology, to finally develop a working bomb and freak out every one of our allies in the Middle East? So I think the JCPOA, the nuclear deal with Iran, which made them give up their fissile material, re-engineer their plutonium reactors so they can't produce plutonium, and accept searching 24/7 inspection of all their known nuclear sites, their mines, their mills, and their enrichment facilities. For 5 years, I think that's a really good deal. Where's the problem? What happens after 7 years and 10 years? And Bibi, if he were here, would tell you forcefully, it's a terrible deal, not for today, not for tomorrow, but because it allows them to enrich and to eventually build a huge arsenal of nuclear weapons. That's not true. On the four corners of the deal, it doesn't say they have the right to produce nuclear weapons anywhere. In fact, the opposite. But I think everyone who is a critic of the deal has a legitimate concern about whether the inspections are as intrusive as they have to be for the long term, and what happens with enrichment in the long term. A. B. Iran keeps launching these ballistic missiles that they shouldn't have, and that should be subject to aggressive sanctions and are outside the deal. Iran is doing really bad things in 3 ways. They keep oppressing their own people. If you protest in Iran, you're going to disappear. A. B. They fund and support terrorism in the region. Hezbollah is a really bad group of people that we, as a country, have declared to be terrorists. And their funding comes principally from Iran. And Iran is using some of the resources they got from that deal and some of the resources they got from being able to sell oil again to fund Shia militias and Hezbollah throughout the region and to support the Houthis in Yemen. This is bad. And they keep shooting off ballistic missiles where they write, death to Israel on the side. So it's not like they're subtle people. I never had the illusion that because of this nuclear deal, they were suddenly going to become westernized Democrats. I just thought it was the least bad option we had in front of us. The president has been given sanctions authority by Congress to use against North Korea, Russia, and Iran. And the subcommittee where I'm the ranking Democrat funds our sanctions effort. We should be sanctioning the daylights out of their ballistic missile program, their Quds Force, the IRGC, and their support for regional terrorism. And I support our active military engagement in Syria and in Iraq, and in supporting Jordan and Israel to push back on Iran. Because I think Iran is one of the baddest deals we've got in the world. So I hope that's not confusing. I thought the deal was worth entering into to constrain their nuclear program. But they're still doing bad stuff, and we should push back on them.
But nothing's happening.
In what sense?
Well, things go on. They do what they want.
No, I'll disagree. They are doing bad things in supporting terrorism and in launching ballistic missiles. Yes. The president and the administration have imposed additional sanctions on Iran for their ballistic missile program. I'm encouraging them to do more. And Iran gave up their stockpile of enriched uranium. It's out of the country. And they filled the center of they had a nuclear reactor that it was on a pathway to producing plutonium. And they filled the middle of it with concrete. They did do that. And they have opened up their sites to inspection by the IAEA. So their mines, their mills, and their enrichment sites are being inspected 24/7, remotely and in person. Those happened, and I think those are a good thing.
Things go for now, we're okay.
I think the nuclear deal, for now, has accomplished its goals, but we have to keep working on improving it for the future with our European allies. I hope I answered your question.
Senator,
Yes?
could you speak to the problem with the Russians rigging the elections? Is there anything for the Senate to do? Is that something that you really have to leave to administrative officials to strengthen our security? Is it something you need to leave to the special prosecutor who's going after people? But recognizing that those things could be going on, in some instances are going on, is there something the Senate should be doing? Because I think that's one of the biggest problems the democracy faces if somebody's monkeying with the elections.
Yes. So let's take a step back for a minute. Did Russia interfere in our 2016 election? Yes. In a hearing in front of the House Intelligence Committee that was public, I think 3 weeks ago, President Trump's choice as head of the CIA, head of the FBI, and the director of national intelligence, all three said, yes, yes, yes. Undisputable. Russia engaged in a broad, well-funded, aggressive campaign to interfere in our elections in 2016 and to favor one candidate over another. Now, it is stunning to me that in that context, our president continues to insist this is a hoax. This is not, those three guys are lifelong conservative Republicans. These are not liberal Democrats who are ticked off about Hillary losing. And it is striking that our president fails to address what is a clear threat to our democracy. The 2018 elections are how long from now? So for us to strengthen our electoral infrastructure as a country, the other thing those three gentlemen said in that hearing, when asked, do you expect Russia to do it again? Yes, yes, yes. I serve on the Foreign Relations Committee. The minority, the Democrats on the Foreign Relations Committee, issued a 150-page report that details 19 other countries where the Russians have interfered in their elections, just in the last 3 years. So when I go to Europe, what do you think I hear in Athens? Help us. When I go to the UK, help us. In the Baltic states, in Eastern Europe, in Central Europe, in Western Europe, the Russians are directly interfering in their elections. Overtly and covertly, with money. They literally finance different campaigns and candidates that are anti-NATO, anti-US, and they engage in cyber activities to tear apart the very fabric of the society we built over 70 years. Is there nothing we can do about it? Absolutely not. The Senate, by a vote of 98-2, gave President Trump strong new powers to sanction Russia. Putin is only going to stop when we stop him. Anybody seen this movie before? What was that guy's name? I mean, it could not be clearer what this guy is trying to do. He invades a country to the east of him. He invades a country to the west of him. He says, the Russians are being oppressed in Georgia. Munch, I need to take a piece of it. He's still occupying it 10 years later. The Russians are being oppressed in Ukraine. Munch, he takes a piece of it. He's still occupying it. Then the guy interferes in Syria on behalf of one of the worst butchers in human history and is the only reason Bashar al-Assad is not in jail. And then he interferes in our election. And what do we do about it? Nothing. I get a little agitated about this. Last month, the president was supposed to give us a report on his actions to use those sanctions authorities. And we got a classified briefing, and because it's classified, I can't tell you that I heard nothing. But I came out, and in response to the question, are you satisfied that the administration is using the sanctions authority you gave him, I said, I am not satisfied. I cannot tell you what I was told, but I am absolutely not satisfied. There is no rational explanation for this failure to defend our democracy. And it alarms me. We have legislation that is bipartisan to try and bring social media ads, which was one of their main avenues, under the rules for election ads. You ever heard this expression, my name is Chris Coons and I approve this ad? When you watch all those terrible ads during the election, we have to put our name and our face on it so you know who's paying for it. All the ads the Russians paid for on Facebook and on Twitter and on Instagram, right? They're not accountable. We had a hearing where several of us just ripped those companies. And I've met with them privately to say, you want to be on the wrong side of history and the wrong side of me. Keep doing what you're doing. Because the idea that Facebook didn't know that these ads were being paid for in rubles from an address in, I'm not kidding, they were paid for in rubles to organize rallies in the United States. I'm like, you guys have unbelievable detailed knowledge of everybody who says and does anything on Facebook, and you didn't pick this one up. So let's not let this repeat. I believe that Delaware's electoral infrastructure is strong enough to survive this, but I am not convinced that most states in the country are. One of our real strengths is that we don't have a unitary national election system like many other countries. It's done at the state and local level. And most of the times you go and vote, that machine is not connected to the internet. So it is hard, but not impossible, for them to figure out how to get in and actually change the votes. Russians got into the electoral systems of more than a dozen states. They didn't get into the machinery, but how do we know they won't next time? And it is dangerous and irresponsible for us not to invest in doing so. Did I answer your question?
Well, yeah, but it sounds like we're in big trouble. What are we going to do? Given our bad situation and the failure of leadership, what can the Senate do?
I am in the minority.
Yeah. We are.
I think I have given as many speeches as any other member of the Senate, in committee hearings, on the floor, in interviews. I try not to do a lot of waving my arms and hyperventilating. But bluntly, I don't know what else to do. I persuaded my friend Marco Rubio from Florida to come to the floor and give a speech with me about the urgency of addressing the Russian threat. This was 6 months ago. Why? Because I think when I go to the floor and give a speech, that's great. But Marco's a member of the Foreign Relations Committee and a conservative Republican. And to have the two of us give the same speech, where it's literally, I give a paragraph, he gives a paragraph, about how outrageous it is that the president's not acting, I would hope that would garner more attention. For me to simply say, look over there, it's their fault, doesn't answer the question. So I'm trying with funding, with sponsorship of bills, by spending time on an airplane overseas, talking with and listening to Republicans to say, don't you think this is a problem? And one of the things I really find hard is when colleagues of mine, who happen to be of the other party, dedicate their time to criticizing the FBI and trying to attack and undermine Robert Mueller. I have a bill with Tom Tillis and Lindsey Graham to make it harder to fire Robert Mueller. but they are trying hard. I expect the president to fire Robert Mueller. Once he indicts someone in his immediate family or his close-in circle. And I've asked every Republican who will meet with me, do you think this would be bad? And they all say, oh yes, absolutely. Be terrible for rule of law. Okay. What are you willing to do about it? Oh, well, we need to wait until that happens. What are you going to do the day after it happens? And I'll close on this. Here's the good news. Bob Mueller is a Republican who was appointed by a Republican to be head of the FBI. A Marine veteran who everybody I've ever talked to who's worked with him says is an absolutely sterling and determined law enforcement professional. If he gets to the end of this investigation and he says, nothing to look at, folks, no collusion, I will accept that. But if he gets to the end of the investigation and he says, here's what I got. I recommend impeachment and indictment. I'm going to follow that too. And I think we've got 60 million people who were for Hillary and about 60 million people who were for Trump. And the worst thing that could happen for our country is that we never get to find out what happened. This guy gets pulled off the case. So the case I try to make to my Republican friends is in the interests of our democracy and rule of law. Let him finish the investigation. And let's follow it where it leads. And then let's move forward, no matter the result. Who else has got a question? You got to get their attention.
Doris, who did you give to? Someone over here.
We desperately need you. Would you consider a run and presidential run and
I'm with the people who are laughing, yes. The question was, would I run for president in 2020? I love my wife and my children. I appreciate the implicit endorsement.
No, it's a plea.
The plate. I've got teenagers who are seniors in high school and a junior in high school. And my focus right now is making sure that I get as much time with my kids as I can before they're gone. And I'll look at this again. I don't think I'm the right candidate. I think that the Democrats will only be successful if we put someone forward who has real governing experience, a governor or a mayor, who is more of a centrist than a partisan ideologue, someone who actually hears the people who voted for Trump because they're angry and feel left out and feel disrespected in our country, but someone who's optimistic, who actually believes in our country. The biggest mistake my party makes is being angry all the time, being resentful at the wealthy, being angry at people who are successful, being angry about things that have happened in the past or could happen in the future. And instead, I think our best candidate will be someone who sees the promise of America, who welcomes immigrants who come here legally, who welcomes investment in science and accountability and transparency around it, and who thinks that our best days are ahead of us, not behind us. I keep looking for that candidate.
You're next. I'm next. Okay. Two things.
Hello, Harriet.
Hi, how are you?
I'm good. Good to see you.
You've been doing a fabulous job. I follow you closely, but
Bring that a little closer. There
all
we
right.
go.
I am wondering why we can't publish who supports locally and nationally the NRA to get on their backs. I can't believe that everybody is so terrified of them that they do anything the NRA says. And it should be announced publicly who these people are so that we can stand against them
Okay.
and not contribute to them.
Thank you. What I think Harriet's saying is I wish I knew who the NRA supports and who they don't. It is actually easy to find public information because the NRA makes contributions directly, and we have to report our contributions. I have never taken a contribution from the NRA. They also didn't offer it. I have twin boys who have different political views. And at one point, one of them said, "Dad, how come you've got an F from the NRA?" And I said, when I ran in 2010, I was kind of offended because they didn't even meet with me. I didn't even get a chance to, right? By 2014, I'd earned it. And I'll say this, the NRA has about 3 million members. There's about 350 million Americans. Their power in Washington is not just because of contributions. We have lots of states in this country where gun ownership, hunting and sportsmanship, and gun ownership for personal protection is a big part of local culture. And the NRA represents what is believed to be the majority opinion of a lot of states. So, let me, you got to ask the question, I'm going to try and answer here. It is a pretty good proxy for what you're going to do and how you're going to vote. And in the Congress of the United States, in the House, there's 435 seats. There's about 30 of them that are genuinely up for grabs. 3 of those are right over the line in Pennsylvania. And I mean literally 10, 15 miles from here. So if you happen to be from Pennsylvania, from Chester County or Delaware County or Bucks County, those will be House races that will determine the future of the House. There are Republicans who are working hard to make changes in how we control violence and guns. And there are Democrats who are on the other side of this for me. So this is not a straight party line issue, but it's about 90-10. And I think if you had a House controlled by the Democratic Party, you would see a very different environment in terms of everything from what kind of legislation you'd see on immigration to what kind of legislation you'd see on taxes to what kind of legislation you'd see on guns. And I'm not saying which result, bless you, you may want, but if you want to see action on these, you got to see a change in control.
Okay.
I get one more question. Is that where we're going?
One more question. The senator has to go to Washington, so we're finishing a little bit early. And I'm sorry, we did see all the people had their hands up. There just wasn't enough time.
Well, my question is almost what she had asked. Why does Wayne LaPierre have so much power? And do the Russians contribute money to the NRA? I had read someplace that $3 million or so was contributed surreptitiously by the Russians. And what angered me so much, when they asked about the assault weapons, Wayne LaPierre said absolutely no.
Correct.
And no one elected him. He had, I mean, why does he speak for all the people?
Okay. He doesn't speak for all the people. And I'll tell you, one of the things that has emerged in Delaware that's significant is a bipartisan, active, well-funded group that advocates for changes to legislation, has succeeded in changing some of our laws in the state of Delaware around background checks and around access to weapons. And Governor Carney and a number of members of the General Assembly have announced they are going to attempt an assault weapons ban in Delaware. This is a different state than many other states. My wife is from Lancaster, Pennsylvania. The first day of hunting season, everybody got off of school to go hunt. And Delaware and Pennsylvania have slightly different cultures around gun ownership and sportsmanship. And when I sit and listen to senators from Texas and Wyoming and Arkansas, they have a very different sense of this. There are relatively few really organized, really active lobbying groups. And the genius of the NRA, the evil genius of the NRA's lobbying on this, has been to assume that people will get bored and change the subject. So in the first couple of days after a big mass shooting, they don't say anything. Then a couple of days later, they start pushing and pushing and pushing. And they come up with a proposal that is the opposite of what folks who'd like to more closely regulate access to guns want. the biggest change that's happened in American politics in the 18 years that I've been elected is after Sandy Hook, there was no organized group that knew how to do this, that showed up, that advocated, that had an agenda. Those parents, when they showed up in Washington, were among the very few. Now, Brady, you know, after President Reagan was shot, the Brady bill was the result of lobbying by someone who was very close to President Reagan and was brutally injured. But in terms of an organized nationwide mass effort by victims of gun violence, that's significantly come up over the last few years. Partly because Michael Bloomberg has funded it, and partly because the families of victims haven't stopped coming. My high school classmate, John Dallas Green, his daughter was murdered next to Gabby Giffords. She was born on 9/11. She was convinced that she had an important place to play in American history. She was student body president of her elementary school. And she turned to her mom and said, I really want to meet my congresswoman. And she went to meet Gabby. I've known Gabby Giffords since she was a state representative. That she survived being shot in the head is a remarkable thing. And that she is today an advocate all over the country, along with her astronaut husband, is a remarkable thing. But I'll never forget being on the floor of the Senate after Sandy Hook when we voted on the Manchin-Toomey bill on background checks. And it failed by just a few votes. And one of those parents from Tucson was up in the balcony and yelled, shame on all of you. And although I voted for that background check bill, it brought me to tears because I could feel the rage of the parents and the families who lost children and loved ones needlessly to gun violence. We can all be more engaged in this. There is stuff we should be doing around mental health. There is. Funding for treatment, making sure folks who've been adjudicated have background checks that are shared with law enforcement. There's more we should do to support law enforcement. There's more we can do to strengthen communities so that we don't have kids thinking guns are the way to solve problems. But frankly, the NRA is only as powerful as they are because there hasn't been a comparably organized, persistent, and funded effort opposing them. If you look at what happened in Australia, it is possible for a country to look at an incident of violence and say, this is nuts. We need to change direction. The United States will never do what Australia did. But we could make real progress in making it harder for people who are felons or mentally ill or convicted of domestic violence to just walk in and get guns. I really hope we will do that. I hope and pray we will do that. Thank you.